Welcome everyone to this event, the latest in our series of webinars for RUSI members and associates. More than 100 years after the terrible events of World War I and of the Gallipoli Campaign in particular, which this annual lecture is designed to mark and commemorate, I'm delighted to introduce RUSI's annual Gallipoli Memorial Lecture, which will be given online via Zoom by His Excellency, the Honourable George Brandis QC, who is High Commissioner for Australia to the UK, and he's going to be talking about defending liberal democracies in an increasingly contested world. As many of you know, this lecture is normally given in RUSI's Library of Military History, so it's perhaps appropriate that I've used the backdrop of our library to create that impression again this year. I think our ancestors who lived through those times would have been all too aware of the impact of pandemics, not least the great pandemic that followed World War I and carried away many millions of our citizens. So social distancing warnings would have been very familiar to them. What they could not have anticipated, I think, is how modern means of communication have drastically altered how we're able to respond. In 1916, they were still almost a decade away from the introduction of television as we have come to know it. So continuity, but also great change, I'm sure, is one of the themes that will come up in the High Commissioner's comments. Before introducing the speaker in more detail, perhaps I can just mention for the audience the attribution rules and the way in which this session works. The address and the prepared remarks will be given on the record, and any remarks made during the Q&A session will also be on the record. If you wish to ask a question, you can do so in writing in the Q&A function, and when we move to that period of the session, I will select questions and endeavour to mention the name of, give the name of the questioner if that is clear from the question itself, and then we will conclude the whole session promptly at 10 o'clock. By way of introduction, the Gallipoli Memorial Lecture was, until 2001, held annually at Eltham Church in southeast London. But since that time, the Gallipoli Memorial Lecture Trust asked if RUSI would carry on that tradition, and we were delighted to do so. The Gallipoli Campaign, of course, began with naval operations on the 19th of February 1915, and by 9th of January the following year, almost a year later, the campaign was over. And by the end of that period, the Allies, a truly multinational force, most prominently including forces from the UK, Australia, New Zealand, India, and France, had lost more than 250,000 men in combat, and the Ottoman Empire had probably lost somewhat more. And today we honour all those who fell in the campaign and those who fought and returned. I'm not going to ask for a formal period of silence, but I know that your thoughts will be with those brave people. Since that time, lectures have been delivered here on the great issues of present-day defence and security. The first lecture was Professor Bob O'Neill shortly after he retired as Professor of the History of War at Oxford, and he spoke on allies and interventions, which indeed is a strong theme throughout our lecture series. Other speakers have included Sir Malcolm Rifkind, well known to many at RUSI, a former British Foreign Secretary and Defence Secretary, who spoke just before the war in Iraq. In 2018, Alan Gingo, the National President of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, explored Australia's past responses to changes in the global order, but the new challenges it faces also. And last year, Admiral Tony Radigan, the First Sea Lord, of course, discussed modern uses of the military instrument. And today we're delighted that our speaker has chosen defending liberal democracies in an increasingly contested world, his title. the title for his address very much in keeping with the subjects we've addressed in previous years. You have his biography. I won't eat into his precious time. I should just mention that he has had a distinguished political career in Australia as a member of the federal parliament. He has been Attorney General, leader of the government in the Senate, federal minister for the arts, and he was appointed High Commissioner for Australia to the United Kingdom, in May 2018, so just over 2 years ago. So, High Commissioner, the floor is yours.
It's a great pleasure to deliver the 2020 Gallipoli Memorial Lecture to the Royal United Services Institute this morning. I am, of course, disappointed not to be with you in person, but I am pleased that we can continue to meet virtually in these most challenging times. The Gallipoli Lecture commemorates and honours the Gallipoli Campaign of 1915. In Australia and New Zealand, the anniversary of the Gallipoli landings on the 25th of April, Anzac Day, is the most emotionally significant national day in our calendars. And as the Australian High Commissioner in London, it has been deeply satisfying to me to see how important the Anzac Day commemoration is in the United Kingdom. When we remember Gallipoli, we inevitably think of the tremendous loss and sacrifice, a tale of husbands, fathers, brothers and sons who will never come home again. But the Gallipoli story is about more than loss of life in an unsuccessful military campaign. It is, as well, a story of heroism and of endurance, of young men who discovered the best of themselves in the worst of all circumstances. For we Australians, it has an even deeper meaning still. The Gallipoli Campaign took place only 14 years after the Commonwealth of Australia was constituted from 6 British colonies to become the world's youngest nation. What Australians call the Anzac Legend, shaped by the hands of historians such as C.W. Bean and Alan Morehouse, became a nationwide story. How brave young men who answered in massive numbers a call to arms to defend what a century ago Australians still call the mother country, made Australia's arrival on the world stage and, by their heroism, announced that we were a country that was prepared to stand by our friends and to fight for what we believed in. In that respect, Australia has never changed. There is, of course, a mythic dimension to this, but it is not just sentimentality. As the great Australian international relations scholar, Professor Robert O'Neill, noted in the inaugural Gallipoli Memorial Lecture, Anzac is also a story of alliances and of international cooperation. It is, in the jargon which diplomats might use today, a story of like-minded nations joining together in the shadow of a world crisis in defence of their common values. Today, we face a different kind of crisis. Yet, as Australia and the United Kingdom did at Gallipoli, throughout the course of the First World War, and in all the great global crises since, we stand together as liberal democracies in defence of our way of life. It is the way we work together and learn from one another, particularly in the face of conduct by nations which do not share our values, on which I want to focus this lecture. That contest of political values and between different systems of government has been thrown into sharp and unexpected relief by the COVID-19 crisis and by the way in which countries with different political systems have responded to it. The last several months have seen the world face a set of challenges largely unanticipated, and undoubtedly unknown in our lifetimes. And while it is far too early in the course of the global health emergency we are currently experiencing to engage in a lessons learned exercise, it is perhaps not too soon to make some tentative observations based upon what we've seen so far. In the first place, it seems clear that the impacts of COVID-19 have been felt differently across the world. Like Australia, many countries are now implementing measures to slow the spread of COVID-19. National responses to the emergency have been calibrated and policies developed, inevitably with an unusually short time for deliberation to meet individual perceptions of that country's particular needs. Most have imposed some form of lockdown, but some have not. Most have closed their borders or restricted travel, but those closures and restrictions have been imposed in different ways and at different times. There has been very different use of track and trace technology among countries which have adopted it at all. While certain restrictions are necessary, governments must ensure COVID-19 emergency measures comply with international human rights obligations. These measures should be proportionate, transparent, non-discriminatory, and temporary. Governments that uphold international law, including human rights, and are transparent and accountable to their people are best placed to protect their populations from the worst effects of the pandemic. They are also more likely to cooperate internationally in ways that promote the common good. And we have seen that COVID-19 is a shared crisis and a timely reminder that many problems are best solved by international cooperation. COVID-19 has shown that the international order is as important as ever. There is certainly need for reform, and at times international organisations struggle to fulfil their mandates. But the pandemic has brought into stark relief the important role that international institutions play in supporting global responses to global problems. And, critically, it has shown the magnitude of the consequences if we fail to ensure that these international institutions are fit for purpose, accountable to member states, and free from undue influence. As Australia's Foreign Minister, Senator Marise Payne, has said, Australia wants international institutions to play an effective role in addressing and coordinating global responses to global problems. We want to see a stronger WHO that is more independent and transparent, trusted to take a leadership role in improving global health security. Australia will advance those interests in response to COVID-19 as part of our plan to step up engagement with multilateral institutions to ensure we advance our interests and objectives as a liberal democracy in the Indo-Pacific. And yet, we've seen some states seek to take advantage of the emergency to pursue interests inimical to our own and to the rules-based international order. That has been concurrent with the COVID-19 crisis. A further sharpening of geopolitical tensions, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. Some countries are choosing this moment to gain strategic advantage at a time when the region should be focused on responding to and recovering from the pandemic. At a deeper level, we have seen attempts by some to use the pandemic to promote what I might call a contest of efficacy between different systems of government based upon criticism of how effectively different countries have responded. Of particular concern, we've seen some countries engage in concerted disinformation along medical, political, and economic lines to complicate healthcare responses and economic recovery efforts. According to a recent Australian Strategic Policy Institute report called Retweeting Through the Great Firewall, this disinformation originates within party state circles and is increasingly being disseminated through network-centric campaigns utilising Western social media platforms. That disinformation has been particularly directed against liberal democracies, in some of which, including the United Kingdom, the spread of the pandemic, at least in its early stages, occurred so widely. By contrast, so the argument goes, a country like China was, because of its different political system, able to contain the spread of the pandemic more swiftly and effectively. There are many weaknesses with that argument, not the least of them that it is too soon in the life cycle of this pandemic to make any definitive judgments about relative success and failure. Secondly, while some of the liberal democracies, such as the United Kingdom and the United States, have seemed to fare worse in comparative terms in the early days, others, such as Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, have been among the most successful in containing and nearly eliminating COVID-19. Thirdly, the argument itself depends upon the reliability of reported case numbers, about which there is already dispute, a dispute which we can expect to continue for a long time to come. Nevertheless, the attempt by some to turn comparative national responses to the pandemic into a critique of the liberal democratic model of governance, whose response is asserted to be disunited and confused, compared with that of single-party states, whose responses are represented to have been decisive, firm, and therefore effective, does tell us that the lines of division in international politics have evolved from the kind of ideological contest which the liberal democracies fought and won in the 20th century into an attack upon the efficacy of our systems of government in protecting our citizens. Of course, pluralism will always look more untidy than conformity. Democracies such as ours, for whom the right of citizens to freely criticise their governments and challenge the wisdom of their leaders, will never have, or wish to have, the apparent unity which authoritarian governments prize. Nations which value freedom of speech, freedom of peaceful protest, freedom of the press, and intellectual freedom will never speak with one voice. Indeed, it is in the babel of many voices, in the contestability of ideas, that we look to discern the best course of action for our governments to take. None of this is weakness. Our freedom is our great strength. Yet, particularly at a time of crisis, it can be misrepresented as confusion. As Australia's Prime Minister Scott Morrison said recently, there are some who believe liberal democracies and free societies cannot cope with these sorts of challenges. We will prove them wrong here in Australia. And in my country, that is precisely what has happened with the fatalities for COVID-19 among a population of 25.7 million, limited to 103. Nevertheless, against such an unanticipated background, the epic contest between what Sir Karl Popper once called open societies and closed ones, between pluralism and authoritarianism, is with us again. Of course, notwithstanding the foolish proclamation of the end of history during the false dawn of the 1990s, it never went away. So one of the key early lessons of the global health emergency is that the liberal democracies must be ever more alert to defend our values, to protect our political systems, and proudly to assert the virtue of free societies organised around the fundamental liberal principle of the inviolable rights of every citizen. We've always known that, but recent events remind us of how vigilant liberal democracies must be. So, what must we do? At a global level, it is ever more important that the liberal democracies strengthen and deepen their cooperation in defence of our common values. Nowhere is that more evident than in Hong Kong. Australia has a substantial stake in Hong Kong's success. It is home to one of our largest expatriate communities, second in fact after the United Kingdom, and is our largest commercial presence in Asia. As Senator Payne has pointed out, Beijing's recent decision to impose new national security laws on Hong Kong is deeply concerning. Along with others in the international community, we continue to raise our serious concerns that the legislation will undermine the one country, two systems principle and erode human rights and individual freedoms that have been guaranteed by the Basic Law and by the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. We have, of course, long cooperated through military alliances. We have done it with increasing levels of engagement through intelligence sharing, most particularly the Five Eyes, which is the closest intelligence partnership in the world. In recent years, the Five Eyes community has expanded beyond a community of intelligence agencies and national security ministers to a forum where, from time to time, foreign ministers, defence ministers, and other ministers meet. We cooperated increasingly through multilateral partnerships between democratic nations, such as in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, comprised of the United States, Australia, Japan, and India, and with ASEAN. And we now see the emergence of the G7+ grouping. We work closely with democratic nations to shape international outcomes in line with our shared interests and values. Australia is an active member of the Human Rights Council, advocating for the promotion and protection of human rights, not only multilaterally, but regionally and bilaterally as well. Australia made a principled call for an independent review of the COVID-19 outbreak to ensure we can act on lessons learned in the wake of the unprecedented human and economic costs of the pandemic. We built a coalition of support and now have a strong mandate for such a review after the World Health Assembly passed a resolution calling for an impartial, independent, and comprehensive evaluation into the lessons learned from the global response to improve prevention and preparedness, and also an investigation to identify the zoonotic source of the virus and the route of introduction to the human population. A record 145 countries co-sponsored the resolution. Australia will continue to work closely with the international community to take these commitments forward, recognising opportunities for early actions without disrupting the ongoing emergency response. And beyond the WHO, we have cooperated in the reform of international organisations. Australia, for instance, has led the way for the reform of the World Trade Organization on issues such as governance and e-commerce. We are delighted that the United Kingdom will soon join us in that campaign. And it is particularly timely to say we must cooperate through trade itself. I offer no view on the decision of the British people to leave the European Union. But one thing is clear now that Brexit has happened. The whole point of global Britain is for this country to be free to pursue its own independent trade policy around the world. And I am delighted that the four countries which Prime Minister Johnson has identified as his first priorities for free trade agreements are like-minded democracies: the United States, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Australia is a proud free trading nation, 76% of our goods and services are exported to nations with which we have free trade or preferential trade agreements. And in the past 3 decades, we have prospered as a consequence, as Britain can do. But whatever the vectors of cooperation may be, militarily, diplomatically, strategically, in intelligence sharing, in the reform of international organisations, through closer trading relationships, the imperative for the liberal democracies to strengthen and deepen their engagement has never been greater than it is today. Not only because such engagement among like-minded partners is a good thing in itself, but because that deeper engagement and mutuality is also a protection from those actors which do not share our values and will, on occasions, act in ways inimical to our interests. Underlying that deepening engagement and cooperation is not merely the recognition that we share similar values and recognise common interests. At the deepest level, it depends upon trust. Earlier this week, the Lowy Institute, which, as I'm sure you know, is one of Australia's premier international affairs think tanks, published its annual report on Australian attitudes to the world, a public opinion poll of everyday Australians to test their opinion of a number of key countries. It pleases me no end to say that the United Kingdom, once again, was judged by Australians as the country they trusted most. Some 84% of Australians think that the United Kingdom is a trustworthy partner. Japan was second at 82%. It is revealing of the current state of public opinion in Australia that on the same metric, Russia fell to 24% and China to 23%. Just as it is important that the liberal democracies deepen their international cooperation, it is also important that we learn from one another in the ways we seek to protect ourselves domestically from evolving threats to our security. The massive growth in various forms of hostile intrusion into the domestic affairs of our countries by both non-state actors and by foreign states or their surrogates has been one of the most alarming developments of recent years, and one which has lately been a primary, indeed I would go so far as to say the primary, focus of the Five Eyes nations. This has taken many forms. Among them are cyber intrusion, electoral property theft, interference in democratic processes by seeking to influence the outcomes of elections, entryism into political parties, strategic acquisition of critical infrastructure and assets, covert interference in government decision-making, interference, both covert and often overt, in universities, the spreading through both the traditional media and more pervasively social media of disinformation. We in Australia have seen all of those phenomena in recent years at a rapidly escalating rate. Australia continues to be targeted by malicious cyber actors. On the 19th of June, only last week, Prime Minister Morrison announced that a sophisticated state-based cyber actor was responsible for a major cyber attack across a range of sectors, including all levels of government, industry, political organisations, education, health, essential service providers, and operators of other critical infrastructure. He refrained from naming the particular country responsible for the attack because the high level required by the Australian government for public attribution had not been reached. In Mr. Morrison's words, the threshold for public attribution on a technical level is extremely high. And so Australia doesn't judge lightly in public attributions. What I simply can confirm is that there are not a large number of state-based actors that can engage in this type of activity. And it is clear based on the advice we've received, this has been done by a state-based actor with very, very significant capabilities. Australia's immediate focus now is on securing the networks, protecting the victims, and conducting ongoing investigation. Australia's response to this and other attacks was in accordance with our national cybersecurity strategy adopted in 2016 and which is currently being updated. That is one of a number of measures which have been adopted by the Australian government during the period since the election of the government of Tony Abbott in 2013 and continue through the governments of Malcolm Turnbull and the now Prime Minister Scott Morrison, which have been designed to harden Australia's defence against hostile foreign intrusion. For most of that time, as the Attorney General in the Abbott and Turnbull governments, and under the Australian system as it then operated, the Minister responsible for domestic national security, I had the responsibility for most of those measures. They included, among other things, legislation to widen the scrutiny of and grounds for the refusal of foreign acquisitions, in particular of critical national infrastructure, such as ports, transport facilities, electricity and telecommunications networks, and other critical national assets. One other important measure Australia has taken has been to reform our foreign interference laws. One thing which is obvious beyond question is that the pervasiveness of foreign interference in Australian domestic affairs has been such that the old law of espionage is entirely inadequate to deal with the problem. On the other hand, we did not want to cast the net so widely as to capture the legitimate prosecution of their interests by foreign governments or other foreign principals. So Australia's foreign interference laws prescribe certain categories of conduct, broader than the old offence of espionage, but nevertheless sufficiently inimical to the national interest, if engaged in covertly on behalf of the foreign government, to attract the operation of the criminal law. Alongside this, to protect, yet make transparent, legitimate activities engaged in on behalf of foreign governments or foreign principals, we introduced a foreign influence transparency scheme, which requires the public registration of those agents of influence, essentially a kind of lobbyists register for those acting on behalf of foreign actors. It is lawful to engage in activity covered by the scheme, provided that the agent is registered and the principal identified. These provisions were based upon and sought to overcome the shortcomings that had been evident in the enforcement of the 1938 American Foreign Agents Registration Act. The legislation for the Australian scheme was presented to the Parliament in late 2017 and came into operation the following year. The advice of Australia's intelligence agencies is that it has been effective in reducing the level of hostile state activity within Australia. I know that there has been a significant degree of interest here in the United Kingdom in adopting a model similar to the Australian legislation. I know in particular there are many in the national security community who wish to see a similar scheme adopted here. I should point out that the Australian foreign interference legislation and foreign influence transparency scheme were developed by Australia explicitly as a Five Eyes project in consultation with the four other governments, so as to produce a world's best practice model which could be readily adopted by others. This and other Australian reforms about which I have spoken is an example of my broader point. The Five Eyes countries in particular, and other liberal democracies as well, need, at a time when global politics is an increasingly contested environment, both to cooperate even more closely internationally and to learn from one another's domestic national security measures to defend our systems and our democratic values. I spoke earlier of the importance of trust. The trust that exists between Australia and the United Kingdom, the fruit of our long history, our shared values, our recognition of common interests, our deep people-to-people links, makes us the most natural of partners. Through highs and lows, we have always been there for one another. Gallipoli was the first great occasion of that, but it has been an emblem of our two nations' shared history ever since. At a time when the rules-based international order is once again being tested, and the values and efficacy of the liberal democracies is once again being challenged, when our political systems are increasingly being threatened by hostile interference, the depth and strength of that partnership has never been so important. Thank you.
Hi, Commissioner. Thank you so much for that both masterful and actually moving presentation, linking very well to a long history of cooperation between our countries and the growing importance of that cooperation today. And I was very struck by your quoting the opinion poll showing how much the UK is trusted by ordinary Australians, which very much accords, I think, with views in the other direction in this country. And it's I was reflecting on why that is in a situation which, if you asked British people whether they trusted their government, the figures would undoubtedly be lower, and probably it might also be the same in your country, I'm not sure. But it's actually it's precisely because we have that plurality of we have that vigorous contestation of policy issues, we have openness and freedom of speech within our countries, that we trust each other because we understand how each other works, and we're able to see that we address these issues seriously and not in a totalitarian fashion. So very, very fascinating. We have a number of really interesting questions in the chat box, and I think we'll try to get through them as much as possible. Please do put your questions in the Q&A function, and I will endeavour to get to them as quickly as possible. So the first question which we were asked during your presentation, which really relates to some of your remarks about the advantages of liberal democracy in tackling the COVID crisis in particular. Glenda Hicks asks, a country that has done extremely well in restricting the COVID-19 spread is Vietnam. They have a more authoritarian government, but their system appears to have worked well. Could you comment, please, on how far that is consistent with your argument about the superiority of liberal democracies in this regard?
Well, thank you for that question. And I don't want to sort of go into the granular detail of each particular country's response, but my point really was a broader one. There is a narrative being developed by some one-party states that one-party states deal with problems of this magnitude better because they are not liberal democracies, because they don't prize or privilege freedom of speech, contestability of ideas, freedom of criticism of measures adopted by governments. And my point really is to argue that that narrative is false, that liberal democracies, and Australia is an example of this, can deal with this as well as, if not better than, authoritarian states because they are liberal democracies. But also to point out that this is a new narrative. I talked about the ideological conflicts of the 20th century. These were conflicts about ideas primarily, and about almost philosophical conflicts about the nature of just societies. The new narrative is about outcomes, and hence the phrase I used, a contest of efficacy.
Very good. Thank you very much, High Commissioner. The next question we have is from Mike Maiden, who asks, what lessons do you think we should learn from COVID-19 about the ability or otherwise of our existing international institutions to deal with international crisis. You did make some remarks, High Commissioner, about the need for reform and development, and I noted that David Cameron, I think it was yesterday, published an op-ed making very much the same point. So do we need new institutions or do we need changes to the ones we have?
Well, as Senator Payne said in the remarks that I quoted, Senator Payne, the Australian Foreign Minister, said, we need institutions that are fit for purpose. Australia has always been a reformer in international institutions, and I instanced the leading role that my country is taking in reforming the World Trade Organization at the moment. And it's not the only international institution in which Australia takes a reformist role. Plainly, international institutions, because they are so encompassing, will be slow to reform. But we can't adopt a set and forget posture. Of course, particularly when the international system is subjected to new and unexpected tests, as it is being at the moment, we have to be alert and nimble to seize the opportunities for reform and build coalitions, especially among like-minded nations, to prosecute the argument for reform.
Very good. Thank you, High Commissioner. So Julian Brazier asks as follows. It would be unfair to ask you to comment on the recent decision to merge the FCO with DFID, but perhaps you could tell us a little bit more about how the coordination of diplomacy and overseas aid works in Australia and whether, in your view, it is working well.
Well, it's of course a matter for the United Kingdom and the United Kingdom system to determine what its machinery of government arrangements are. But I can tell you that the Australian experience of the merger of our development aid agency, which was an agency called AusAid, it wasn't a department of government, it was a statutory agency that operated within the Foreign Affairs Department portfolio, but nevertheless with a high level of autonomy. AusAid was merged with the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade after the election of the Abbott government in 2013. And although an important machinery of government change like that was always going to elicit a variety of views, I think we Australians can say that there is an overwhelming view that that merger has been a success. It has given a greater degree of focus and cohesiveness between our foreign policy objectives in general and our development aid objectives in particular, which we have focused more and more on our immediate region, that is the Southwest Pacific.
Very, very interesting. Thank you very much. I have a question from Joe Oliver, who asks, in the UK, the ongoing debate about Winston Churchill's legacy has flared up again recently, particularly around his statue and his role in colonialism. Would you say something about how Churchill is currently viewed in Australia, where, of course, his legacy is so bound up with Gallipoli?
Well, notwithstanding that Churchill was the author of the Gallipoli idea and the idea of opening the second front in the cabinet debates in 1914 and 1915. Churchill is overwhelmingly remembered in Australia, as I'm sure he is in the United Kingdom, for his role as an extraordinary wartime leader who defied Hitler. And when there were voices, including voices at the highest levels of government, that wished to pursue a more conciliatory policy, was defiant and ultimately successful. So the simple answer is Winston Churchill is regarded by the overwhelming majority of Australians as a very great man.
And I think that very much parallels how he is viewed in this country, if I may say so. So next from our Vice Chair at RUSI, Sir John Scarlett, who asks, you discussed the growth of foreign interference. You also mentioned universities and education. Is this an especially difficult and important challenge to confront?
Well, Sir John, it's a particular particularly difficult instance of a general phenomenon. Universities uniquely need to prize intellectual freedom more than most institutions in society. They depend on international collaboration in research in particular. And the international student population is an increasingly mobile population. Nevertheless, we need to be alert to, and I know people in the United Kingdom are alert to, as we are in Australia, that because of the very nature of their modalities, really, universities are probably more susceptible to interference than most institutions.
Very good. So here we go. So we have John Moulton, who is a US Navy Fellow at Oxford's Changing Character War Centre, who's asking, with the opponent at Gallipoli transforming to an ally by the time of the Korean War, albeit with a change in form of government, do you see a similar possibility, perhaps over time, for China?
Well, look, I'm not going to comment on Chinese politics, and the answer is I don't know. I don't profess to be an expert on domestic Chinese politics, and the honest answer is I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows.
Very good. Next question from Tony, who asks, how is it that China is identified as our #1 strategic threat and is accused of undermining our democratic institutions, yet, and I think this is a reference to Australia rather than the UK, yet our immigration policy is unaligned with ongoing large Chinese immigration, potentially creating a possibility for further interference in Australian affairs?
Well, I would stress that with the exception of the observations that I made about Hong Kong, which are specific and contemporary, of course, what I spoke of in my scripted remarks was generic and country agnostic. We are very firm in Australia that our laws, for example, our foreign interference laws, our foreign investment review laws, are country agnostic as they are. They apply to any actor or any state, any nation, including, I might say, a liberal democracy, with equal force.
Very good. We have an interesting question from Mark, who's posted in the chat, but I can still see it, who's really asked about whether in a situation which some would argue that the ability of the UK to work closely with like-minded democracies has been weakened by Brexit, whether there are ways in which Five Eyes, you talked about the widening role of Five Eyes, are there ways in which the Five Eyes mechanism or something related to it can be widened to include some of the UK's closest allies in NATO and in particular in Europe?
Well, I mean, the Five Eyes community, on which I used to represent Australia at a ministerial level, of course, is a unique relationship. But it is no secret that there is a very extensive cooperation between the intelligence agencies of Five Eyes countries and the intelligence agencies of other democratic nations. And there is a discussion increasingly about whether the Five Eyes should be expanded. Now, that's a decision for ministers and governments to make. But I think the Five Eyes community is a model of success when it comes to what began as an intelligence sharing community, expanding outward beyond merely intelligence sharing and interagency cooperation to a broader basis in which foreign ministers, defence ministers, national security ministers, home affairs ministers can meet to share ideas and perspectives, and where appropriate agree on common approaches.
But insofar as Five Eyes extends beyond intelligence into that broader foreign defence policy cooperation, I think many in the UK would ask, is this essentially complementary to our very close relationships with our NATO European allies. It shouldn't be competitive, it should be complementary and
certainly not.
Reinforcing.
And I think there's, quite a dense network of various platforms of cooperation that the United Kingdom has, that Australia has. Some of them we share, some of them we don't. For example, the United Kingdom isn't a member of the Quad. Japan isn't a member of the Five Eyes. Neither of us are members of NATO, although we have observer status, and I think Japan does too. So I don't think we should almost literally, if not metaphorically, miss the forest for the trees here. All vectors of international cooperation between like-minded nations, between like-minded liberal democracies, are a good thing in themselves.
Right, here's a rather different but very interesting question related to your remarks about FTAs and the UK's priorities. It's from Robert Walter, who says, the UK currently has a very large trade surplus with Australia. Does Australia see a UK-Australia trade deal as a means to close that gap to Australia's advantage?
We see it as a win-win proposition. The United Kingdom is Australia's 7th largest trading partner. Before 1973, it was our largest. So we do see an opportunity for there to be greater UK penetration into the Australian market for both goods and services. And because trade agreements do essentially depend on reciprocity for greater Australian presence in the British market as well.
Perhaps I could ask myself a related question, which is one of the consequences of the very rapid economic development of China over the last couple of decades is that China has now become a much more important trading partner to Australia, more so than it is to the UK. And I wonder whether that has created some strategic dependencies which Australia would like to be able to reduce over time.
Well, you're right when you say that China is a very important trading partner for Australia. In fact, it represents 40% of our international trade. But we are two countries with entirely different systems, and China understands and accommodates the fact that Australia's principal alliance partner in our hemisphere is the United States under the Anzac Treaty. The great work of Australian diplomacy is to maintain in balance a healthy trading relationship, while at the same time defending and demanding respect for our right to defend our values and our interests as a liberal democracy, and our strategic partnerships with countries like the United States. And I think that is something, well, there have been from time to time points of tension, but that is something that I think Australia has shown can be done successfully. In other words, it's not a prosperity versus security proposition. If it's done skillfully, both of those desiderata can be achieved.
Very good. Thank you very much. I think we have time for one last question, which is from Lorraine Falvey, and she is a psychologist, and she's asked, you mentioned freedom of speech, but it appears to me that freedom of speech has been steadily eroded over the past few decades, particularly if you disagree with the minority narrative. This leaves people less likely to speak up and debate ideas. And I wonder whether you could, from an Australian perspective in particular, whether this is a concern in Australia.
Well, it certainly is. And we have had in recent years in Australia a very similar debate about freedom of speech to the debate that has been going on in the United Kingdom for some years. As a diplomatic representative, it's not for me to say, but I can point to the fact that as the Attorney General responsible more than almost any other minister for the statutes that impinged upon this area, I was proudly and loudly a John Stuart Mill free speech fundamentalist.
Very good, and a very direct response, if I may say so. We've got a hard stop at 10 o'clock, so we're going to bring this to a close, but can I say on behalf of all our audience, more than 100 people who have been listening throughout, that's been an absolutely fascinating presentation. And also you've handled those questions with aplomb and directly, which has been absolutely in the spirit of both our countries' traditions. We've had some pretty hard questions, as I'm sure you're anticipating, but you've answered them, I think, from my point of view at least, very successfully indeed. And I think it's a testament to the close relationship between both our countries that Australia has been such a strong supporter of this Gallipoli lecture series ever since the UK, ever since RUSI started it. So I'd like to, on behalf of everybody, thank the High Commissioner for attending and giving his presentation. And the presentation will be available in due course on our website. So those of you who haven't, who would like to tell your friends about it, please do so. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.